All right, let's dive into this, huh? Physicalism.
Yeah.
It sounds pretty straightforward, right?
hmm
At first glance, at least. Everything that exists is ultimately, like, physical.
Hmm.
But, as I'm sure you know as a philosopher, it gets a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on physicalism.
Great source.
Yeah. To really explore what this whole concept is all about, the different interpretations and all the challenges that it faces.
It's really fascinating because, it forces us to ask some pretty basic questions about, like, the nature of reality.
Yeah.
Like, if you were to break the universe down, into its tiniest pieces,
Mhm.
would you find anything that's not physical?
Right. Like imagine the universe is like, I don't know, a giant Lego set.
Okay, yeah.
Is everything in it from like, distant galaxies to feelings to the very concept of justice, is it all just ultimately built from those Lego bricks?
Yeah, and that brings us to kind of the first big question, right? What does it even mean to say that everything is physical?
Right.
Philosophers, they like to call this the completeness question, because even if we accept that everything has a physical basis, how do you go about explaining the things that don't really seem physical? In the everyday sense of the word, at least.
Yeah.
Things like consciousness, emotions, even abstract ideas like numbers.
Yeah, it's like I can hold a Lego brick in my hand, but I can't hold the feeling of happiness, right? Or the concept of infinity. They seem to be like totally different categories.
Yeah, they do. And that's one of the major challenges for physicalism, for sure. One way that physicalists try to address this is through the concept of supervenience.
Okay.
You can think about the pixels on your computer screen.
Right.
The arrangement of these tiny physical dots, they determine the image that you see, even though the image itself isn't like made of pixels the same way a brick wall is made of bricks.
So are you saying that in a similar way, the arrangement of the physical stuff in the universe, that might determine like everything else?
Yeah.
Even the non-physical stuff, like my brain states give rise to my thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. Physicalism suggests that the physical facts, they determine all the facts.
Okay.
But this then brings up a really tricky question. Could there be two universes that are physically identical, right,
Mm.
down to the last atom, but they're somehow different in some non-physical way? For you, as a philosopher, this is kind of like the classic problem of necessary connections, between distinct existences.
Well, okay, I'm getting like Matrix vibes here. Like, what if there's multiple realities that are all built on the same physical, like, foundation,
Yeah.
but with, like, different experiences kind of layered on top?
It's a thought-provoking analogy. And now physicalists, they've also tried to define their views, more precisely. For example, some have proposed what's called identity physicalism,
Okay.
which claims that mental states are literally identical to brain states.
So, like, my feeling of joy is actually just a certain pattern of neurons firing in my brain.
Exactly. And then there's this other view called realization physicalism,
Okay.
which suggests that mental states are realized by physical states.
Okay.
It's a bit more flexible. It allows for the possibility that, the same mental state could be realized by, different physical systems.
Okay, so doesn't that run into a bit of a problem with like, the idea of different brains having similar mental states?
Yeah.
Like if two brains have different structures but experience the same feeling of joy,
Hmm.
how can that feeling be identical to two different physical things?
Yeah, you've hit on a really key point there. This idea of multiple realizability is a big challenge to identity physicalism, for sure. And it's led many to embrace more kind of nuanced versions of physicalism. But even if we can kind of, get around that, we run into another really a fundamental question. What even counts as physical in the first place?
Yeah.
Philosophers sometimes call this the condition question.
Right. We've been throwing around this word physical
Yeah.
like it's this simple, clear-cut concept.
Right.
But is it really?
Well, not really. Philosophers have come up with different ways to define what actually makes something physical.
Okay.
One approach is what's called the theory-based view, which basically says a property is physical if our best scientific theories, especially physics, can describe it.
So if physics can talk about it, it's physical.
Right.
That makes sense, kind of, on the surface.
Yeah.
But it also seems to be putting a lot of faith in physics being like the ultimate judge of what's real and what's not.
It does, and that leads to a potential problem, right? What if our current physics is incomplete? Does that mean our understanding of physicalism is incomplete, always changing as physics advances? And this brings us to, this philosophical puzzle known as Hempel's dilemma.
Okay, Hempel's dilemma. Unpack that a bit.
Okay, so in simple terms, Hempel's dilemma asks, is physicalism tied to, like, today's physics, which, might be wrong, or is it based on some, like, future, maybe completely different ideal physics, which we may never actually discover?
Mm.
It's a tough question because it raises this possibility that maybe our definition of physical is like a moving target.
So you don't even know what physical means.
Right.
And yet physicalism is saying that everything is physical. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep like changing shape.
Yeah, exactly. It highlights the tension between like relying on this framework, science that's constantly evolving
Yeah.
and trying to establish this metaphysical principle that's supposed to be absolute, like physicalism.
Okay.
Now, besides this theory-based view, there's another way to define physical, and it's called the object-based view.
Okay, this one sounds a bit more grounded. What's the idea behind this one?
The object-based view says something's physical if it's a characteristic of, the things that we typically think of as physical, like rocks, planets, trees, even the atoms that make those things up. Their properties like being solid or having a location in space or having mass. These would all be considered physical properties.
Okay, so we're like basing our definition of physical on the things that we can see and interact with out in the world.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But what if we discover something totally new about those objects? Like what if we discover that rocks are conscious?
That's a great question, and it brings us back to this issue of whether like our current understanding of physical is really complete.
Right.
And this leads to some of the most compelling challenges to physicalism. Like, hold on. Even if we grant you this physical idea, there's still some things that don't fit.
Okay, so let's get into those challenges. What are some of the big arguments against physicalism?
Well, there are quite a few, and they've been keeping philosophers busy for a long time. But, probably the most persistent one centers around this concept of qualia.
Qualia, right. The subjective, what it's like aspect of experience.
Yeah.
The redness of red, the feeling of pain, the taste of chocolate. These things seem like they just resist being explained, in purely physical terms.
Yeah, you got it. And there's this famous thought experiment. It's called Mary's Room by Frank Jackson.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
Okay, so imagine this brilliant neuroscientist. Her name is Mary, and she lives in this black and white room. She knows everything, absolutely everything, about the physics and the biology of color vision, but she's never actually seen color.
I'm sensing a but coming here.
But one day, she steps out of that room and sees, a red apple for the very first time.
Okay, yeah.
Jackson's argument is that in that moment, Mary learns something new. Something that she couldn't have possibly learned from all of her physical knowledge.
Yeah.
She learns what it's like to see red.
So this gets right to the heart of the qualia problem, right?
Exactly.
Like, even if you understand the physical mechanisms behind something, there's still this subjective element to the experience that a purely physical description can't capture. Knowing about red isn't the same as actually experiencing red.
Exactly. And that subjective, that what it's likeness, that's what qualia is. It's this powerful challenge to physicalism because it suggests there's something about conscious experience that goes beyond just the physical facts.
Yeah, this Mary's Room thing really, it really makes you think, like, is there some fundamental limit to what a purely physical explanation can even achieve when we're talking about consciousness?
It certainly makes you wonder. Now, in addition to qualia, there's another major challenge to physicalism, kind of lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce.
Okay, hit me with it. What else does physicalism have trouble explaining?
This one's all about the aboutness of our thoughts.
Okay.
Philosophers, we call it intentionality, the fact that our mental states, they can be directed at things out in the world.
So like when I believe that the earth is round, or I hope for a sunny day?
Exactly. The challenge for physicalism here is how can physical processes, which just seem to be about, cause and effect, actually represent stuff in the world?
Yeah.
How can a purely physical system, have meaning?
Right. It's like trying to explain how the firing of neurons in my brain can represent the concept of justice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or the meaning of a poem. Those seem like they're on, different levels of reality.
Precisely. And this is where arguments that come from, Wittgenstein's later work, they come in, challenging that a purely physical account, that it can really capture the richness of intentionality, especially when it comes to language and thought.
So we've got these big philosophical questions about meaning, about representation, clashing with the kind of the core of physicalism.
Yeah,
If everything's physical, how do we explain that our minds can be about things that aren't just physical stuff?
you got it. And that's where the debate gets really heated. Physicalists have offered up a bunch of counterarguments, often drawing on pretty sophisticated theories of language, of cognition, to try and demonstrate that you can, in fact, ground intentionality in a physicalist worldview. But even with all that, this question of intentionality, it remains a big challenge.
Okay, so we've got qualia and intentionality both kind of giving physicalism a hard time. But isn't there another challenge lurking out there?
Mm-hmm.
What about those abstract objects we talked about earlier?
Right.
Numbers, mathematical theorems, concepts like truth. How do those fit into a purely physical universe?
Yeah, you're right. The problem of abstract objects, this is a major headache for physicalists. These abstract things, they don't seem to exist in space and time like physical objects do. It's tough to imagine how they could be reduced to or even supervene on the physical.
It's like if everything is physical, shouldn't we be able to find some physical stuff that corresponds to, like, the number 7? Or the Pythagorean theorem, but that sounds crazy.
Right, and this presents a real dilemma. If they can't account for these abstract objects, then their claim that everything is physical, it seems to fall short.
So what are their options here? Do they just give up and say, well, maybe not everything is physical?
Well, some might be tempted to go that route, admit that, yeah, abstract objects are a real limit to physicalism. But others have offered more nuanced responses. One approach is to just embrace nominalism,
Okay.
which just denies the existence of abstract objects altogether.
Nominalism. Isn't that kind of like sweeping the problem under the rug?
Mm,
Just saying they don't exist and hoping nobody notices?
it can feel that way. Another option, maybe a bit more palatable, is to try to broaden the definition of physical to make room for these abstract entities.
Okay.
Arguing that while they're not physical in the traditional sense, maybe they're still part of this, like, topic neutral realm that intersects with the physical world.
So instead of trying to, like, cram these abstract objects into the physical box, they're creating a middle ground where they can exist without contradicting the basic idea of physicalism.
Exactly. It's a way of saying, like, we don't have to force everything into the same category. Maybe there's this bigger category that encompasses both the physical and the abstract without violating those core physicalist principles. Of course, not everybody buys that. And the debate about abstract objects, it still rages on in philosophy.
Right. So we've got these, like, clever workarounds. But even with them, there's this nagging question. Are we even focusing on the right thing here? Is this whole debate about physicalism, is it maybe taking us down a philosophical rabbit hole?
That's a good thought. And some critics would say, this philosophical quest to defend physicalism, it might be distracting us from a more scientifically grounded approach to the mind and consciousness.
Okay.
Thinkers like Noam Chomsky, they voice this kind of criticism.
So he's saying, hey, we've got these amazing scientific tools to explore the world, including the brain.
Yeah.
So why get stuck in abstract debates when we could be out there making real discoveries? Kind of a less talk, more lab work approach.
You got it. He's pointing to the success of fields like neuroscience, cognitive science, making huge strides in understanding how the mind works without relying on, grand pronouncements about the nature of the physical.
So it's less about saying everything is physical and more about saying, let's use the tools we have to understand how things actually work and see where that takes us.
Right.
This approach, it's often called methodological naturalism.
Okay.
It says we should be guided by the methods, the principles of natural science in our search for knowledge. Focus on what we can observe, what we can test, rather than getting tangled up in, abstract metaphysical debates.
But doesn't that raise the question of whether science can really give us a complete picture of reality? Especially when it comes to things like subjective experience. It feels like there might be a gap there that science can't quite bridge.
That's a key point of contention. Some philosophers, like Thomas Nagel, they'd say the objective methods of science, they're inherently limited when it comes to understanding subjective experience.
Right, like in his paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?
Exactly.
He argues that there's something about that first-person perspective that you just can't capture with a purely objective scientific description.
Right. Science can tell us all about, the bat's sonar system, its brain structure, its behavior even, but it can't tell us what it feels like to be a bat.
To experience the world through its senses. And that what it's likeness, that subjective quality of experience, that's what Nagel thinks might be just fundamentally inaccessible to objective scientific inquiry.
Mm.
It's a powerful counterpoint to the idea that science alone can provide us with a complete picture of reality.
So we've got criticisms coming from both sides. Those who say physicalism can't handle qualia, intentionality, abstract objects, and then those who question this whole project of physicalism,
Yeah.
saying a more scientifically driven approach would be better.
It's a multifaceted landscape, for sure. Compelling arguments on both sides. But before we wrap up, I think we should also consider the case for physicalism.
Okay.
Why is it so appealing to so many philosophers? Why has it become such a dominant view in contemporary thought?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in the criticisms, but there must be some strong reasons why people find physicalism convincing. What are those reasons?
Well, one of the biggest reasons is the incredible success of, the physical sciences.
Right.
Physics especially has given us such a powerful framework for understanding the world around us.
Yeah, from like tiny subatomic particles to
Yeah.
the vast expanse of the cosmos.
Exactly.
It's really hard to argue with the results, right? I mean, physics has an incredible track record when it comes to like making predictions and, leading to all these technological breakthroughs. Like it's given us this deep understanding of like, the fundamental building blocks of the universe and the laws that govern them.
Absolutely. And that's led a lot of philosophers to believe that, a physicalist view of the world, it's just the most elegant, it's the most explanatorily powerful way to really make sense of reality.
Yeah, it's like why add in all this extra non-physical stuff when the physical stuff seems to be doing like such a good job on its own?
Right.
It's like that Occam's razor thing, right?
That's right.
The simplest explanation is usually the best one.
Right.
If we can explain everything we see in terms of physical processes, then why complicate things?
Right, exactly. And this whole line of thinking, it often gets support from what's called the argument from causal closure.
Okay.
It starts with this idea that every event that has a cause has a physical cause.
So we're assuming that the physical world is like a closed system, no outside influences, no non-physical realm messing things up.
Right. And from there, the argument says, look, mental events, they clearly have physical effects.
Okay. Yeah.
So if I decide to raise my hand, that's a mental event.
Right.
But then my hand goes up, that's a physical event.
Right. So if mental events can cause physical events and the physical world is this closed system,
Yeah.
then those mental events have to be rooted in the physical world themselves.
Exactly. It suggests that mental events can't be this separate, non-physical stuff just floating around. They have to be part of that physical causal order somehow.
It's a really compelling argument, but it does seem to rely on that causal closure assumption,
It does.
which, as we've said, not everyone agrees with.
Right. That assumption is not universal. But even if we grant it, there's still the question of how mental events are a part of the physical world.
Right. Does it mean that our thoughts, our feelings are literally just physical processes in the brain? Or is there some other, more subtle relationship?
Yeah, that's the question. And, as we touched on earlier, some physicalists, like those who are into identity theory, they would say, yep, mental states are literally identical to brain states. Your feeling of joy, that is just a pattern of neural activity, nothing more, nothing less.
No mysterious non-physical stuff, just neurons doing their thing.
Exactly. But other physicalists, those who lean towards functionalism, they take a different approach. They say that mental states, they're defined by what they do, their functional roles,
Okay.
rather than what they're made of.
So it's less about the physical stuff and more about the information processing that's happening.
Right. Functionalism allows for the possibility that, the same mental state could be realized in different physical systems.
Right.
Just like different computer hardware, they can run the same software.
Makes sense. It seems like there's like a whole spectrum of views within physicalism, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. And navigating that spectrum, that's a big part of what makes philosophy of mind so interesting,
Yeah.
grappling with these questions about the relationship between mental and subjective and objective.
So where does all of this leave us? We've heard these compelling arguments against physicalism, the challenges with qualia, with intentionality, with abstract objects.
Right.
And we talked about the idea that maybe this whole project of physicalism is kind of on the wrong track.
Yeah.
Maybe a more scientifically driven approach is the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
But then we've also seen these really powerful arguments in favor of physicalism.
Mm-hmm.
based on the success of the physical sciences.
Mm.
And that idea that physicalism is like the simplest, most elegant explanation.
Yeah, it's a complex landscape for sure. And the truth of physicalism, it's still a very hotly debated topic in philosophy.
Yeah.
But I think even without having a definitive answer, engaging with these questions, it's been incredibly valuable.
I agree. It's really made me think about this stuff in a whole new way.
Yeah.
What stands out to you as the most important takeaway from our deep dive?
I think for me, it's realizing that even if physicalism is true, it doesn't diminish the richness and complexity of our inner lives. Even if our thoughts and feelings are ultimately rooted in physical processes, that doesn't mean they're any less real or meaningful.
That's a great point. And whether or not physicalism is the ultimate answer, it's clear that understanding the physical world is a crucial part of understanding ourselves and the universe.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive into physicalism, I wanted to leave you with a final thought. Imagine that in the future, physics makes this radical discovery. It reveals that some of the most fundamental entities in the universe, they're in a way mental. Would that make those entities physical? Or would we have to completely rethink what physical even means?
Whoa, that's a real head scratcher. It kind of takes us back to that idea that defining physical might be this constantly evolving process,
Yeah.
always changing as we learn more about the universe.
Exactly. It shows how hard it is to define something so fundamental, especially when our scientific understanding is always changing. And it raises the possibility that maybe there are aspects of reality that go beyond our traditional ideas of mental and physical.
So we end up with more questions than answers. But hopefully, with the deeper understanding of the complexities, the mysteries at the heart of this debate. And as we continue to explore the universe and ourselves, we might discover that the boundaries between physical and non-physical aren't as clear-cut as we thought.
Yeah, the journey of discovery goes on.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into physicalism. We'll see you next time.